There's a school of thought that says that to be a credible suspect, to be the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper, the person must have been suspected by the police at the time. I'll test this theory with reference to a man named in a report that was filed in Scotland Yard by one of the most senior late Victorian police officers. This man was named as one of the 3 most likely suspects, but before we get into him, who were these senior police officers and where can we find this report? The author of the report was a man called Melville Macnaghten. He was second in command of the Criminal Investigation Department, the CID, as Assistant Chief Constable. He was appointed to that role in June 1889 and was the actual Chief Constable of the CID when he wrote this particular report in 1894. Bear in mind that the murders of which he wrote happened in 1888, 6 years before, and even before his appointment. Although he would have had full access to all the files and he would have known about the case via his colleagues. Prior to joining the police at this senior rank, Macnaghten's experience was in managing family tea plantations in India. It might surprise some viewers, but appointments to the most senior positions at Scotland Yard were not based upon working one's way up through the ranks and having experience in fighting crime. It was more a case of who you knew. The report also passed through the hands of his immediate superior, Robert Anderson. Anderson was appointed Assistant Commissioner Crime at Scotland Yard just as the Ripper case started in 1888, but he was on extended holiday leave and so wasn't actually physically in position when the first 2 murders of the first 2 so-called canonical murders took place. He was another political appointee. Anderson's background was at the Home Office, where he had been employed with matters relating to prisons and political crime. Now, there are 2 versions of this report. There is the so-called Aberconway version, which was Macnaghten's draft report. Macnaghten's daughter married Lord Aberconway. As the 2nd Baroness Aberconway, she first showed this draft report to a Jack the Ripper author called Daniel Farson in 1959, hence the naming of the document. It seems to have been a mostly typed up, there's some written notes, mostly typed up out of some handwritten notes that had been, were among the papers left to Macnaghten's children when he and his wife died. The official final handwritten version, known properly as the Macnaghten Memorandum, was filed at Scotland Yard on the 23rd of February 1894. It is now in the Public Record Office. It was first published in 1975 in a book called The Complete Jack the Ripper by Donald Rumbelow. That was when it was first published in full. Extracts had been published before that. I personally find the term Aberconway version slightly irritating. I would prefer it if this document was known simply as Macnaghten's initial draft, as that accurately describes the nature of the document, with the document residing at the Public Record Office simply known as the official final draft. That is really what they are. That the Aberconway version, I'll have to keep using that term, that the Aberconway version preceded the official version that's in the Public Record Office is determined by various editorial changes between the 2 documents. In the Aberconway version, there's a preference for Montague Druitt as the culprit, and of the three that are named in it, and he's known to be Macnaghten's favoured option. Clearly, after this version was written and submitted upstairs, and the only person upstairs was Anderson. So once Anderson had eyes on it, the tone changed, and in the final version is more neutral between the 3 named suspects. the only logical interpretation to explain these differences is that the Aberconway version was Macnaghten's version. He passed it up to Anderson. He did a few changes, made it more neutral between the suspects. It makes no sense for Macnaghten to have rewritten the memorandum to favour Druitt as a private copy to keep afterwards, after he'd submitted a neutral version in the first place, if that had happened. As I said, it only makes sense that the version he submitted is broadly similar to the Aberconway version. Anderson made a few corrections, toned down the pro-Druitt stuff, and that's the final version we have in the Public Record Office. In any case, whichever version you may think came first, both reports had three favoured suspects: Druitt, Kosminski, and a third man called Michael Ostrog. It's Michael Ostrog who we'll focus on in this episode. Spoiler alert, I'm well aware that some people will already know exactly what's coming. Now, as Ostrog was retained as a suspect by Anderson, as one of the three leading suspects by Anderson, after he'd reviewed Macnaghten's initial draft, Anderson must have concurred with his inclusion as one of the three. So it's more than fair to gauge the state of the police intelligence and knowledge and the value we should put on the other two named suspects with reference to Ostrog, because he is one of the three main ones by Anderson and Macnaghten. First, let's deal with the Aberconway version as it deals with Ostrog. No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer unless possibly it was the city PC who was on a beat near Mitre Square, and no proof could in any way ever be brought against anyone, although very many homicidal maniacs were at one time or another suspected. I enumerate the cases of three men against whom police held very reasonable suspicion. Personally, and after much careful and deliberate consideration, I'm inclined to exonerate the last two, but have always held strong opinions regarding number one. And the more I think the matter over, the stronger do these opinions become. The truth, however, will never be known, and did indeed at one time lie at the bottom of the Thames, if my conjectures be correct. So here, Macnaghten admits there's no proof against any suspect, but he expresses his strong opinions about Druitt, who drowned in the Thames. However, he states that the police had very reasonable suspicion against three men, one of which was Michael Ostrog, a mad Russian doctor and a convict, and unquestionably a homicidal maniac. This man was said to have been habitually cruel to women, and for a long time was known to have carried about him surgical knives and other instruments. His antecedents were the very worst, and his whereabouts at the time of the Whitechapel murders could never be satisfactorily accounted for. He is still alive. In the official version, we can see that Macnaghten's preference for Druitt has been removed. No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer. Many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one. I may mention the cases of three men, any one of whom would have been more likely than Cutbush to have committed this series of murders. The same three men are mentioned: Druitt, Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and a convict, who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. This man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. The main difference between the two versions so far as Ostrog is concerned is that the official version, it was believed that he was later detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac, while the Aberconway version lists extra details pertaining to Ostrog's homicidal mania. That Anderson had seen and approved the official version, including Ostrog's status as a leading suspect is further underlined by a passage in a book published in 1898 by Major Arthur Griffiths, the inspector of Her Majesty's prisons. He had that role from 1878 till 1896. The book was called Mysteries of Police and Crime. The outside public may think that the identity of that later miscreant, Jack the Ripper, was never revealed. So far as actual knowledge goes, this is undoubtedly true. But the police, after the last murder, had brought their investigations to the point of strongly suspecting several persons, all of them known to be homicidal lunatics, and against 3 of these they held very plausible and reasonable grounds for suspicion. The second possible criminal was a Russian doctor, also insane, who had been a convict both in England and Siberia. This man was in the habit of carrying about surgical knives and instruments in his pockets. His antecedents were the very worst, and at the time of the Whitechapel murders he was in hiding, or at least his whereabouts were never exactly known. Griffiths did not name Kosminski, Druitt or Ostrog, but it is very clear who he was referring to. Furthermore, it is without doubt that Griffiths had spoken to both Macnaghten and Anderson. I'll provide a link to an interesting paper on this topic in the description below. Note that Griffiths published his book in 1898, 4 years after the memorandum had been filed, and as Griffiths had an ongoing friendly relationship with both Macnaghten and Anderson, it must be the case that the opinions of both of these 2 senior policemen were the same in 1898 as in 1894. So it's clear that Ostrog was a serious and major suspect so far as the higher ranks of the Metropolitan Police were concerned. Soon after the Jack the Ripper murders had taken place, Michael Ostrog was a sneak thief and a confidence trickster. His exact background is unknown, but he was believed to have been born in around 1833, probably in Warsaw, now in Poland, then part of Russia. Listing his crimes would take some time. The most noticeable thing to me is that he regularly and almost immediately got caught every time. He was hardly a master criminal, and I can't help but feel that there were mental health issues involved. He was evidently quite clever and could speak about 8 languages and had polished manners. He was often incorrectly characterised as a doctor, this being one of his fictitious cover stories. The first crime which he is known to have committed was in 1863, when he was arrested after some petty thefts at Oxford University, for which he received 10 months in jail. Upon release, he made his way to Bishop Stortford on the western side of Essex next to Hertfordshire, and flitted between there and Cambridge University, conning gullible people out of money wherever he went, and then he was arrested again and got 3 months jail in 1864. He next turned up and after a brief period of liberty was jailed in Exeter for another 8 months in January 1865. From Devon, when he was released, Ostrog went to Gloucestershire and conned money out of various people before getting arrested in October 1865. This is the one occasion where he got lucky, extremely lucky, and he was acquitted. After a petty theft spree across Kent in March and April 1866, he was caught, and the first instance of aggression is noted as he resisted arrest. This time, in view of his past offences, which had been committed under a variety of names, which had done him no good at all in trying to conceal his true identity from the authorities, he was given a more lengthy sentence, 7 years penal servitude. He was released in May 1873, but went on another spree of petty theft from Woolwich to Windsor to Eton College, during which he passed himself off as a Russian aristocrat and proposed to the daughter of a wealthy gentleman before almost getting caught by the police in the West End, but he successfully evaded them by fleeing across the rooftops with a loaded revolver. Another instance of aggression. He was finally arrested in Burton-on-Trent, still with his revolver, which he never used, and was given a 10-year sentence, followed by 7 years under police supervision. He was released in August 1883 on licence, or as they then termed it, on a ticket of leave, having spent the best part of 20 years in jail. He soon appeared in the Police Gazette, a bi-weekly newspaper issued by the Metropolitan Police, listing wanted felons for not reporting regularly to the police station. Ostrog seems to have gone to France, as he was deported from there in 1886. In July 1887, he was arrested for petty theft in Woolwich and attempted to commit suicide. Instead, he was given 6 months hard labour. He ended up being sent to the Surrey Pauper Lunatic Asylum in Tooting, suffering from mania, but was released in March 1888 as cured. We're getting close to that Ripper period, aren't we? March 1888. Police witnesses at his trial were certain that he had been shamming insanity. He was clearly very reluctant to go back to actual proper jails. Incidentally, as this episode is about someone whose status as a suspect reflects upon all the other police suspects and upon Kosminski and Druitt in particular, I can be sure that it will provoke howls of outrage from some predictable quarters. My last video, which to most people was on a detailed and arcane subject, the reliability of Harriet Lilly as a witness, really set some people's teeth on edge, and no word of a lie, one group wanted to try and get this channel banned as a result. Anyway, don't let that put you off subscribing, liking, I hope, and comment yourself below. Expect some robust backward and forward argument. Anyway, onwards to the rest of the film. In the commission of these various crimes, for which I've only given obviously a very brief summary, Ostrog went under a bewildering array of false names. Bertrand Ashley, Claude Clayton, Dr. Grant, John Evest, Stanistan Sublinski, John Sobieski, Count Sobieski, Dr. Barker, Max Grief Goslar, Ashley Nobokov, Stanislav Lublinsky, and others. Not that it did him much good in terms of escaping justice. The police recorded them all, and when they apprehended him, they linked him to his earlier crimes. Criminals, or those seeking to evade justice, frequently, believe it or not, use false names. Although some geniuses in the wacky world of Ripperology deny this. At least they do when the suspect's called Lechmere. But anyway, let's move on. Ostrog again appeared in the Police Gazette on the 26th of October 1888, soon after the double event murders, for not reporting to a police station, almost certainly indicating that the police were looking for him in connection with the Whitechapel murders at the time of the Whitechapel murders. The report read, "Special attention is called to this dangerous man." Why special attention and why dangerous? His record suggested otherwise. He appeared again in the Police Gazette shortly after the murder of Alice Mackenzie on the 9th of August 1889. Again, it called for special attention to this dangerous man. Going by Ostrog's record and contrasting that to the descriptions in either version of the Macnaghten Memorandum, he wasn't really a doctor, although he sometimes claimed he was. He was indeed a regular convict. He showed no signs of homicidal mania, although he had briefly been detained in a lunatic asylum. There was no evidence of cruelty to women, apart from perhaps entering into a bogus engagement. There was no evidence of him carrying surgical knives, although he once had a loaded revolver which he didn't use. His whereabouts were indeed unknown, as shown by the entry in the Police Gazette in 1888, and he was alive, that much was true. So Macnaghten's account of Ostrog approved by Anderson, were not exactly accurate. Nevertheless, he was on the top 3 suspects, almost certainly on the basis that he had been released from an asylum not long before the murders started. And of course, he was a foreign criminal. In the early 1970s, before the Scotland Yard files had been transferred to the Public Record Office, Donald Rumbelow, Stephen Knight, author of The Final Solution, which is the main Masonic conspiracy book on Jack the Ripper, and Paul Bonner, a BBC researcher, had access to the suspect files that resulted from the actual investigation, which have since gone missing. And they made notes of the contents. The names Kosminski, Druitt and Ostrog did not appear anywhere. This is suggestive that none of these were actively investigated by the police on the ground in the East End during the murders. In April 1891, Ostrog had finally been arrested for failing to report under his ticket of leave, but before he could be properly examined in court, he was committed to Banstead Lunatic Asylum in Surrey. His notes said he was suicidal, but not dangerous to others, and he was in a weak physical condition. Macnaghten was aware of this because he wrote to Banstead Lunatic Asylum in May 1891 saying, "I shall feel obliged if you'll cause immediate information to be sent to this office in the event of his discharge, as the magistrate adjourned the case sine die, in order that he might be again brought up and dealt with for failing to report himself, if it is found that he is feigning insanity." I'll make one quick point here as a sidebar. Macnaghten wrote to Banstead to make sure that they told him if Ostrog was released, but only if he was feigning madness. Surely the police would have done the same for Kosminski if he was such a strong suspect, but nothing appears in his notes in the asylum to support this anywhere. Anyway, Ostrog was released in May 1893. He was soon arrested for various thefts in Kent, but escaped, which seems remarkable if he was a serious Ripper suspect. But from there, he went back to Eton College, coincidentally Macnaghten's old school, where he engaged in more pilfering, for which he was arrested in June 1894, not long after Macnaghten had filed his memorandum in the February of that year. During his new trial, it came to light that Ostrog had been in jail in France in 1889 and 1890. This was his alibi for another instance of pilfering and confidence trickery in Eton in 1889, which he had also been accused of falsely in this case. Nevertheless, for his other crimes, Ostrog was jailed for 5 more years. Ostrog next appeared in 1898 when he was arrested for another petty theft in Woolwich, for which he got 6 weeks. After that, in 1900, he got caught stealing a microscope from the London Hospital Medical College, which might be Ostrog's only connection to the East End. He was sent to Wormwood Scrubs for 5 more years, but was discharged early in 1904, when he also appeared in the Habitual Criminals Register. I've mentioned this book, The Complete History of Jack the Ripper by Philip Sugden, in a few previous films. It has a similar title to the Donald Rumbelow book I mentioned near the beginning of this film. Now, this book isn't perfect, but it's probably the best general history of the case. And here's the denouement. I'd mentioned earlier that it came to light during Ostrog's trial in June 1894 that had been in France in 1889 and 1890. Sugden investigated the background to this and found via the Paris archives that on the 26th of July 1888, Ostrog had been arrested in Paris for the theft of a microscope and was held until sentenced for 2 years on the 14th of November 1888. So he was indeed incarcerated in France in 1889 and 1890, and also in 1888, during the whole period of the Jack the Ripper murders. The police were clearly unaware that Ostrog was in a French jail during the Ripper murders. In France, he called himself Stanistan Sublinski or Lublinsky. He came to their attention, the police's attention in this country, in 1891 and told them he'd been in France, and yet they didn't put two and two together. That the police made Ostrog a leading suspect just because he was someone they didn't like the look of, while they were unaware that he was incarcerated at the time in France, accurately sums up the level of police intelligence. And I use that word very, very loosely. Their suspicion of Ostrog obviously cannot have had any investigative basis. It cannot have been because he was seen in the East End at the time, because he was in France. The details about him in both versions of the Macnaghten Memorandum are typically inaccurate, which tells us all we need to know about the worth of that document as a guide to credible suspects. This is one of those rare episodes where I haven't mentioned Charles Lechmere. Okay, I mentioned him once. He remains the only credible suspect to be the killer known to history as Jack the Ripper. Okay, I mentioned him twice there. Now, of the other suspects, I started with Michael Ostrog because he's low-hanging fruit, easy to dismiss. But he exactly demonstrates why the police suspects are of no value. His inclusion in the Macnaghten Memorandum, which must have been approved by Robert Anderson, completely undermines anything any of these officers have to say about any other suspect. And not to disappoint anyone, I'll come on to those other suspects in future episodes to see what they tell us about prejudice and policing in the late 19th century. Thank you for watching. Look out for future episodes. Please subscribe, share, like and comment below.